couple of things to note before you actually start sewing. Make sure that the bobbin, and that's the one that goes in the bottom of the sewing machine if you have one. If you don't have a sewing machine, sewing by hand is fine. But yeah, make sure that the bobbin has a good amount of thread on it. The last thing you want is to be sewing a really long seam and then suddenly and you realise that you've run out of thread. And then you have to do the whole thing over again. It's a nightmare. The other thing to bear in mind is that you should try and match your threads to the material you're working with. So as you can see, we've loaded up with red because we're working with a red material. Because if you look on your real clothes, if you look in the seams, you'll see that they've actually used the same colour threads as they have with the material, because otherwise, if the material were to stretch, it would be really obvious that the wrong coloured thread had been used, unless it's being used for a decorative purpose. But since we're not, we're going to go with this. Now, another thing to use is to get a piece of scrap material, and you do this with any new material you're working with, or if you haven't used a sewing machine in a while. It's just a way of, you fold it over, and you fold it over however you're going to be working with it, and it's just basically to test how well it goes through the sewing machine, and it allows you to test different stitches. Like, for example, as you can see here, the fabric isn't really moving, and that's the trouble with PVC, is because if you're trying to do like a hem where you've got to fold it over and you've got to stitch with this side on the outside, then there's a lot of friction builds up and it gets stuck. So it can be, from this point of view, it can be difficult to work with. So if you're going to hem it, you're going to probably have to resort to using something like bias binding or an overlocker if you have one. This is the way you're going to be working with most of the jacket. How you've got the two right sides facing in towards each other, and you've got the easier side on the outside on both the underside and on the top. So even though I'm actually doing this one-handed and I really shouldn't be, you can see that unlike before, it is actually beginning to go through. Unlike before when it wouldn't move an inch. With our threads loaded, material tested, and all the pieces cut out and a bit all over, and a cat on the laptop, we're ready to begin sewing. Right, well, we're getting to the point where we're going to be making the collar. Now, the instructions say pin fusible interfacing to wrong side of undercollar. Now, interfacing looks like this, and you can get two types. You can get iron-on, and this is iron-on, and the store will be able to tell you. And you can also get sew-on, and they come in all different thicknesses, and it depends what you're using them for. Now, if you've ever wondered what gives collars that little bit of extra stiffness, or the cuffs of jackets, it's normally going to be this stuff. It helps maintain shape. So what we've got to do is we've now got to take the pattern pieces we used to make the collar, and we're going to line them up and we're going to cut out some interfacing. Important things to worry about when concerning interfacing. If you're going to start using interfacing, then it's probably best to buy, 5-8 meters of the stuff, because it's relatively cheap and you're going to be using it for everything, so it's not like you have to buy in bits. And if you take to buying things by like 5 meters or in large amounts, it means that if you then need it for another cosplay, you're probably going to be able to use it as well without having to go and buy some more and guessing how much you're going to need. although on the back of patterns it does tend to give you a rough estimate of what you're going to need depending on the size you're making. So that can always help. Now with iron-on interfacing, there's a smooth side and then there's a rough, slightly shiny side. And the easiest way to see the shine is to hold it up to the light, although I don't think the camera is going to capture it. So what you do is you heat up your iron and you lay it on the material so it covers all of the wrong side. We don't put this to the right side. Now if you've cut it slightly too big, that's fine, because at the end of the day you're going to trim it anyway, because that's what you do with seams, and it's always better to have too much than too little. So then you take your iron, preferably without putting crap in front of the camera, and you iron it on. Now I will admit that using iron-on is much easier, and if you can, use it. However, because it's iron-on, you're dealing with heat, so some fabrics aren't going to respond well to that. In fact, the PVC does have a tendency to crinkle a bit. We can get away with it for now, but when you're dealing with fabrics that are going to be exposed to heat, again, get a small piece from the scraps, test that with your iron, and if it has a bad reaction, then use the stitch-on stuff. It's just as effective.